you see this addiction to fossil fuels, almost like a cultural addiction. It's not so much about the performance of the fossil fuels. It's like, I need the rev of the engine.
Arctic, I understand, is the new top of the world, or the new center of the world. What is happening around it due to climate change and the melting ice?
If you want evidence that blockchain can disrupt payments, we've had it for 20 years. It's just that it's not a market we like to pay attention to. It's not sexy. It's not Silicon Valley. It's not New York.
And that refers also to financial markets, that optimists win over the long term.
In the long run, you win. We are stepping into an uninsurable world, right, where there's just too much risk attached to these assets. And as a result, the insurance industry doesn't want to touch them. Close to 90% of new capital expenditure in the global south is in renewable energy infrastructure. And it's not because they're trying to meet their Paris commitments. It's not because Greta Thunberg made them feel guilty. They just want energy. They want the lights to be on.
Hello, Swedbank Private Banking clients. Today we have a guest who has come all the way from Vancouver, Canada, to speak on climate change and investments. And today's guest is Dr. Džastins Bulls. Hi, Justin.
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And I know you flew in late last night, and today when we're recording, it's 12 o'clock in Riga.
Yeah, my body thinks it's 2 a.m, but let's not talk about that.
Okay, so in Canada it's 2 a.m, so even more so. Thanks for coming, and I'm super happy to have you on our podcast. Džastins is an expert in sustainable business, and for 20 years he has worked with leading brands to launch products and services that make money while doing good. He has worked with brands like IKEA, Rolling Stone, and World Wildlife Fund. And Džastins has also worked with indigenous communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to help them engage in sustainable economic development. And Dr. Bulls is also a member of the faculty at the business school in Canada, in the best business school in Canada, UBC Sauder School of Business at the University of British Columbia. And since the main theme of this podcast is investments, I would like to use your expertise to deep dive in how climate change will affect different regions and industries, and thus also our investments. So, did I say everything correct about you?
You said everything correctly, and my boss will be very happy that you said UBC is the best business school in Canada. So thank you.
Omitted, I wanted to say it's also one of the leading business schools in the world, I think.
I would like to think so, certainly in areas of sustainability.
Okay, but before we take the global scope of climate change, I have a very local question to you that would be of interest, I think, to all Latvians or Baltic people. I've read a couple of years ago that the Baltic region might become more like the Mediterranean. I understand you arrived last night and haven't seen much of Latvia, but we have around 5 kilometers of white sanded beaches, but unfortunately a summer of 2 or 3 months long. So the question is, will this climate change happen, and do we have a hope of having a longer and warmer summer here?
So it's funny because in British Columbia, where I come from, we often joke, well, will we become like California? Is it going to be sunny and warm here?
It's the same.
And it's a tempting idea, but I think there's one of the big errors that was made in the climate change movement was to talk about global warming as it's just everything's just getting warmer. Because then you come from the Baltics, you come from British Columbia, you think it's going to be warmer. That's fantastic, right? Mm-hmm. There was another thought leader in this space, a gentleman called Amaury Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute. In the 1990s, he said, the big error we've made is we called it global warming. We need to call it global weirding. Everything is just going to get weird, right? We're going to get snows earlier than we used to, or snows later than we used to. We're going to get longer summers and shorter summers. We're just going to get volatility. And so, yes, we may have slightly warmer summers or slightly longer summers, but we also may end up with deeper freezes. And so I think that's one of the sort of the cognitive shifts that we have to make as we think about climate is it's not necessarily that just everything will just get a little bit warmer. It's that everything will just get a little bit weirder. And so I'd like to tell your audience and you that, well, let's just keep going with this climate change business. It's going to be really good for you. Go invest in some beachside real estate in Latvia. But that's not how I think about it. Right? I would think about it as in terms of introducing just more volatility and unpredictability into the ecological systems that we rely on.
Speaking of the beachside real estate, I've also read a lot of studies of high net worth individuals globally that a major part of them now take sustainability and climate change as part of an impacting factor of their financial decisions or of investments. And that ranges both from real estate or where they keep their yachts and, of course, where they invest in the financial markets. But maybe you can, before we jump into the financial markets, maybe you could comment what will happen with the real estate and also insurance market in the future.
I mean, from a real estate perspective, it really depends on what segment of the market you're in, right? So let me pick like a very contemporary example. California had the Palisades fires in January of 2025, right? Very valuable real estate, like billions of dollars just burned to the ground. And the challenge for those homeowners now is going to be, one, getting access to home insurance to rebuild, and two, access to mortgages to rebuild. Because those lenders and those insurers are going to look at that region and say, is climate risk adequately priced in these assets, right? If this is a fire-prone region with inadequate capacity to fight these fires, how are we ever going to price these assets and lend against these assets, right? So from an insurance perspective, I love this framing. It's not mine, but I'll borrow it. This notion that we are stepping into an uninsurable world, right? Where there's just too much risk attached to these assets. And as a result, the insurance industry doesn't want to touch them, right? For example, in Florida, for your average homeowner now, their insurance bill is higher than their mortgage, right? And so you see a downward pressure on asset value because of climate, but also the fact that fewer and fewer people are able to access lending markets. And indeed, Florida, which is I think now a famously sort of right-leaning conservative jurisdiction in the United States, the state has had to federalize, basically take control of the insurance market because the private actors weren't willing to operate in that market anymore. So from an insurance side, they just see climate risk as investment risk. From a high net worth individual side, I think the problem is that all of the negative effects of climate are at the moment being sort of expressed as volatility, right? Expressed as increasing extremes, whether extreme colds or extreme heat or extreme weather systems, whatever it might be. But it's not yet expressing itself in terms of the underlying structural changes that we might be concerned about with climate. For example, we know that we are on a path to rising sea levels, right? They're rising. If we stopped emitting carbon dioxide as a species tomorrow, right? Let's just say we magically add a magic wand, no more fossil fuels. That's fantastic, right? However, we're still locked into a lot of sea level rise, right? These ice sheets are taking their time to melt. Greenland ice sheet alone will contribute maybe something like 38 centimeters of sea level rise over the next century, right? It's just that it's over a century. So the person buying like a beachfront mansion in West Palm Beach is not going to be alive in a century, right? Well, maybe they will. I mean, maybe they're hoping AI.
Well, maybe with AI development, maybe he will.
Or maybe they'll freeze themselves or upload their brain into a computer. But my point is, it's like climate risk tends to express itself over a time scale which financial markets aren't particularly well equipped to understand, and which humans aren't particularly well equipped to understand. Right?
That's a very good quote.
Yeah.
But what is happening? You mentioned Florida, and what maybe you can give a short overview or summary. What is happening globally now with climate change and the fight of it? Well, currently the main person in charge, I would say, Donald Trump or President Trump hates renewables and thinks climate change is fake news. So what is happening? What are the trends now? What are the main things to watch out for?
I mean, it depends on, do you want to be a pessimist or do you want to be an optimist,
well,
right?
Normally I'm an optimist. And,
so the optimistic take is we have the solutions in terms of decarbonizing our transportation systems, largely with batteries, right? We have the solutions that we need in terms of decarbonizing our energy systems, whether that's with solar or wind, right? And battery energy storage systems, right? We have the solutions that we need in terms of integrating these systems together so that they can be smart and dynamic and supply and demand can respond. And we have them now at a scale where they're cheaper and better than the incumbent systems, right? So I would argue that Donald Trump's rejection of renewables maybe is rooted in some trauma about proposed windmills near his golf course in Scotland. Like, who knows, right? But it's ideological. It's not economic, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also, I think, representative of a deeper geopolitical trend, right? We have essentially the United States committed to being a petrostate in perpetuity. and trying to undermine anything that would make the United States not like a fossil fuel addicted nation. And you have China essentially trying to set up an alternative infrastructure of being an electro state. And so that's like that dynamic. Because I would say, oddly enough, China has stood up the tech stack for the world to decarbonize. And now the world has to pick between their allegiances. Like, are we going to go with the Chinese electro stack and all of the trade-offs and tensions that might represent? Or are we going to remain dependent on fossil fuels and all the trade-offs and tensions that might represent? And so the optimist in me would say, hey, look, I've already got the better and cheaper solutions available to me at scale, de-risked by Chinese investment and essentially Chinese expertise in manufacturing, which has driven these prices down so low that I can deploy solar energy anywhere, right? I can buy an EV for less cost and for better performance in almost every market. But on the flip side, you see this addiction to fossil fuels, almost like a cultural addiction. It's not so much about the performance of the fossil fuels. It's like, I need the rev of the engine, right? I need firm baseload power 24/7, 365. And don't make me ask hard questions about dynamic supply and dynamic demand and connecting all. It just sounds too complicated for me. I want to burn some coal, please.
Clash between two ideologies, as you said. And I found it very interesting. We discussed this China question with you already before when preparing for this podcast. I also read about it and basically understand that China is now a global superpower in renewable energy, which to me actually, well, at least 5 years ago, it would have seemed weird. Mm-hmm. And I also understand that China is exporting the renewables in greater volumes in euro or dollar terms than the US is exporting fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So this is amazing.
It's the speed at which everyone always kind of said like, oh, well, China just is like the world's factory, right? Mm. And it's going to make our toys and our kitchen appliances and everything like this. But they just kept moving up the tech stack and started to make increasingly more sophisticated products to now where they're producing cars that are better and cheaper than what most Western car makers are producing. Like, they have surpassed Volkswagen. They have surpassed Mercedes. They have surpassed Audi. And those companies are sitting there not knowing how to act, not knowing how to behave, desperate for government to support them, to put in place non-tariff trade barriers. Let's make incentives to keep these cars out. We don't want them to disrupt our market. Like the speed at which China has decarbonized its own electricity sector, for example, right? Like, yes, they're building coal like crazy, right? At the same time as building solar panels like crazy. Right? There's some really fascinating trade-offs in China because they're not willing to sacrifice energy availability for carbon, right? But what they do see is that I don't want to be dependent on any other nation state for a source of energy, right? I don't want Putin's gas. I don't want MBS's oil, right? So we'll burn coal because it's domestic and it's local while we continue to build out solar. But they have the capacity manufacturing now for about 1,700 gigawatt hours of solar a year, like an enormous amount of solar capacity that they have. And they can't even install enough of it locally. So they're starting to export this overseas. And so I think the really interesting, like the markets that I would pay attention to are not necessarily what are the Americans are doing. I don't care what the Americans are doing. I care what's Pakistan doing. What's Namibia doing, right? What are developing economies that don't have any particular allegiance to one country or the other, right? They don't have an allegiance to the petro economy. They don't have an allegiance to the electro economy. They just say, give me something that's better and cheaper and can be deployed easily. And that's where solar really wins, right? You want to get dependent on natural gas. I have to build LNG import facilities. I have to build natural gas infrastructure. I have to build pipelines. This is all very expensive and timely, right? If I want to bring in some solar panels, I can just whip them up in a few short weeks, right? I don't need that kind of infrastructure. It all fits in a shipping container, right? So Pakistan, for example, in about a year, imported 1/3 of their total electricity generation capacity in 1 year. In the form of solar panels. And most of that has gotten installed at the household or the community level, not even part of a central grid, right? They're just building essentially individuals saying this centralized system doesn't work well for us. I'm just going to put a solar panel on my roof so I can have some light at night so that I can keep my stove on, right? And so you see this kind of leapfrogging of the command and control centralized approach to energy with this decentralized, cheap, abundant energy system. And that's going to really take off in the global south, where you see somewhere close to 90% of new capital expenditure in the global south is in renewable energy infrastructure, not in fossil fuel infrastructure. And it's not because they're trying to meet their Paris commitments. It's not because Greta Thunberg made them feel guilty, right? It's because they just want energy. They want the lights to be on.
And it's cheaper than fossil fuel.
And it's cheaper. Right.
So basically, well, I hear that the good news is that the renewable energy transition or revolution is already taking place. Perhaps the bad news for Europe and maybe USA is that it's in a way controlled by China.
Absolutely. Because China set themselves up to do well if the world solves climate change. The United States has set itself up to do poorly if the world solves climate change. And Europe is sort of stuck in the middle, making these political commitments, wanting to be responsible, wanting to be sustainable, but recognizing that its industrial base can't compete with the Chinese. And so you have this really interesting like security geopolitical challenge because I get it. Like I want Germans to make cars. I think it's a nice thing for them to make cars. I just think they make inferior, more expensive cars, right? And that is so hard for them to internalize, right? That essentially we taught the Chinese how to make really good cars. Now they're making better cars than us for a fraction of the cost. And how are we supposed to respond? How do I balance my commitment to employment, to quality of life, to economic security with desire to decarbonize my economy, right? And the idea that there aren't trade-offs here, it's tough, right? But the thing that I would say, and because we've seen energy being weaponized for geopolitical reasons, right? Yeah. We see someone say, threaten your access to natural gas if you don't do what I say, right? Once I import and install a solar panel, President Xi can't shut it down, right? And so there is this different dynamic that's playing out here where fossil fuels, like we act as if the status quo is somehow the less precarious option, right? It's like, well, who are we dependent on in these systems at the moment, right? What regimes or what ideas, what ideologies get stood up and supported by dependence on fossil fuels versus the regimes and ideologies and ideas that get stood up by dependence on clean tech. So it's just messy. Right. It's
messy and a bit geopolitical, I would say. And I have a next question to you, which I myself find very interesting and which is also in the media and there's a lot of action around it, that basically if you look at the map as we've always used to do, that you see like Europe, US, Canada, and so on, the center of it. But if you take a look at the map or the globe from the top, the Arctic, I understand, is the new top of the world, or the new center of the world. What is happening around it due to climate change and the melting ice?
Well, obviously, I think the Arctic is warming faster than any other region on Earth. Because unlike Antarctica, it's not a solid piece of land. Like when it tilts towards the sun all summer and the sea ice starts to break down, it gets harder for sea ice to form in subsequent years because that ocean is heating up, it's warming up. And so we've seen well over 1 degree of warming in the Arctic in just the last decade, right? So the Paris Agreement talks about 1.5 degrees of warming globally by the end of this century. And the Arctic is like, well, hold my beer. I've warmed 1 degree in the last decade. And so the possibility of an ice-free Arctic introduces a host of challenges. And I think Canada understands that very well.
And opportunities
the Nordics,
as well,
right?
I guess.
Pardon me?
Also opportunities.
Huge opportunity, right? In terms of shipping, the production and shipping time between Asia and Europe could be substantial. The exploration and exploitation of new resources up there could be substantial. But which resources becomes really interesting, right? Is it because will an ice-free Arctic be good for oil exploration, or will it be good for critical minerals? Right? And will it be good for both? As we build an infrastructure, as it becomes a new geopolitical theater, it's going to be really tricky. And so what's interesting is I think Canada is waking up to this political reality that certainly other countries, Russia in particular, doesn't respect Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, and Canada's looking to align itself with the Americans, but more importantly, align itself with the Nordics to sort of express control.
President Trump also doesn't respect it entirely.
I mean, President Trump is a wild card, right? Yeah. I think chaos is his superpower. And no, he certainly doesn't, but we can't be making long-run geopolitical sort of strategic decisions based off of the sort of the volatility of Trump, because it's not entirely clear if he has a foreign policy doctrine, right? Because he was going to, first it was like, I want Greenland, and then I want Panama, and now I want Canada to be the 51st state, until it's no longer politically convenient to have those conversations anymore because he's going to create some new sources of distraction over here. I need to invade Venezuela next, and then I'm going to move over here. We're not even 12 months in. So I think the smart thing is to not be a prisoner of the moment in terms of what's going on geopolitically, but instead just recognize the Arctic is going to shift really quickly, and you need to have the ability to assert sovereignty and build infrastructure so that if people try and infringe and find that coalition of sort of middle income countries, right? Not a game of great power politics, but rather values aligned, smart friends. I think the deputy prime minister of Sweden was just in Canada last week talking about how countries need to pick their friends very wisely, and that countries like Canada and Sweden need to recognize we're friends. Right. And it's very smart for us the stronger we are together, the more we can resist the imperial impulses of these great powers.
That is true. Yeah. So I think that the Arctic, as you said, is also a very interesting spot on the globe right now. But if we jump from regions into industries, I've listened to some of your presentations, historic ones, and I've heard that you are an optimist in a way, that you have said that the climate change is also a massive business opportunity in disguise. So what are the opportunities industry or technology-wise that the climate change is currently proposing?
Yeah, I can't help but be an optimist, and largely because I encountered this framing once, which is that pessimists, they sound clever, right? And optimists change the world.
Exactly. And that refers also to financial markets, that optimists win over the long term.
In the long run, you win. Yeah. And so, look, I think the thing that we have to recognize with why climate is a business opportunity is because climate action needs to not just reduce emissions, it needs to make people's lives better, right? So I was in Shanghai earlier this year, right? City of, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 22 and 38 million people, right? It's almost the population of Canada in one metropolitan region. And I'm sitting in downtown Shanghai having a coffee on the street side. And typically this would be like an unpleasant activity. It would be loud, it would be noisy, it would be dirty, there'd be air pollution, but it was quiet and clean because everything has been electrified, right? Every scooter is electric, every car is electric, people are on their bikes, people are on the street, people are taking mass transportation. And do I think that the government of Shanghai and China aggressively moved to decarbonize their transportation industry because they were really concerned with atmospheric concentrations of CO2? Or do I think they did it because they wanted clean air in their cities? They wanted quiet cities. They wanted energy security, right? They wanted to create a more livable environment for their community, right? And so I think that those kind of ancillary benefits to decarbonization, right? I actually don't think that emissions reduction is the point of the spear, so to speak, right? I think emissions reduction needs to be a co-benefit of making energy more abundant and more available, right? And cheaper. I think emissions reduction needs to go along with just more livable cities, right? And therein lies the business opportunity. If we can sort of recognize that the tech stack to decarbonize is available to us, but I'm going to sell it to the public and I'm going to build a political coalition around this, not around meeting my Paris commitments, but around just making my city more livable, right? Making people's quality of life improve, right? Too often the discourses around climate have been one of sacrifice, right? We'll solve climate change when people are ready to sacrifice, do more, do less. Right? You get to have less, travel less, do less. But it was like, well, what if climate action is a story of abundance? You get more. You get more energy, right? You get cheaper energy. You get a more interesting life. You get more opportunity, right? And I don't mean more in terms of like overconsumption, that we should all be getting excited about Black Friday deals or whatever it might be. But in terms of just time with friends, time with family, time doing the things that are important to you. Right, that's the story of sustainability that I think that the most passionate advocates sometimes forget. They're so animated morality. So to go to your point, what are investors going to care about, right? Well, an investor should see the fact that there are all these technologies which are existing, frankly, emerging outside of advanced economies, right? Whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's in emerging economies in Latin America and South Asia, right? I think people there are solving climate change, not because they're trying to reduce emissions, but because they're trying to improve people's quality of life, right? And so I think investors should be traveling to these countries, looking for the businesses, looking for the things that are getting stood up in Bangalore and asking themselves, how could this get stood up, in Munich? Like, stop thinking that we have all the answers, right? And start recognizing many of these solutions are overseas, and there's a really interesting arbitrage play.
But so what I'm hearing basically that climate change has had a wrong marketing thesis from the start, that we should have focused not on emissions, but on other things. But so you say that the best basically should go to the east to look for the opportunities. But what are maybe some of the examples or industries that you see are interesting to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, so I heard an interesting story recently about a big Silicon Valley venture capitalist who went to China to talk to folks in their automotive industry. And one of the things that he noticed is that their executive teams, their CEOs, they knew all the great Western entrepreneurs, right? They know Steve Jobs, they know Elon Musk, they know Bill Gates, they know their life story, they've read their books, they listen to the podcast, they're obsessed with all of these tech leaders. They want to learn everything they can, right? And then he flies back to San Francisco and he asks his friend in the investment community, who's your favorite Chinese CEO? How do you follow what's going on in China, right? And they couldn't name a single one. Right? They're obsessed with learning about us, but we're almost arrogant about not wanting to learn about what's going on there. And so again, I think it depends on what region I'm investing in, what business line I'm in. But I would be looking, okay, what am I doing? We've talked a lot about cars, so let's not talk about cars anymore. We can think about energy systems, right? We can think about the built environment. How am I heating and cooling my homes? And are there better ways of doing that compared to what I'm currently doing? We could talk about just how we're connecting all of this together with digital economy. Right. For example, I was at a Christmas market in Munich yesterday, and I was trying to pay with cash, and they looked at me as if I had said something offensive without cash. Pardon me. Right. I was like trying to just pay with a credit card, and they looked at me. It was like I was crazy. It was like, how could you possibly pay with a credit card?
I have to jump in. I told Justin that tomorrow the Riga Christmas market is opening, and I think you can pay with card.
Oh, yeah.
So Latvia, I think, is doing
I'm not
quite
surprised,
well.
Right? I'm not surprised by this, but you go into a restaurant in Shanghai and you scan a QR code at your table, which pops up the menu. You order the items. You never talk to a server. A robot brings you the food at your table. You then, at the end of your meal, scan the code again. You pay automatically through an app, and you walk out of the restaurant. Right? Fully integrated, fully automated, incredible user experience where I could speak I don't speak a word of Chinese, and I'm hanging out in Shanghai, able to order all the food I want. Payments are processed seamlessly, and it's an incredible user experience. And the restaurant is able to capture more margin on this because they've fully digitized their user experience. Right? And so I just think being curious about what's going on in these emerging economies, how are they doing things? Like, a classic but old example was M-Pesa, which is like a blockchain-based currency that's popular in Kenya, right? And a majority of payments transactions in Kenya are still to this day made over the M-Pesa network, which is a 15-year-old blockchain. Like Bitcoin is fine as like a hedge or as a bet against volatility or as a speculative investment asset. But if you want evidence that blockchain can disrupt payments, we've had it for 20 years. It's just that it's not a market we like to pay attention to. Right? Because it's not sexy. It's not Silicon Valley. It's not New York. It's not this. It doesn't fit into this modality that the innovation always has to be from the West,
or
right?
From Silicon Valley mainly,
or from Silicon Valley in particular, right? And so, like, I could go on at great length about how the Chinese are probably going to eat our lunch on AI for the same set of reasons, but I'll set that aside.
But actually, my next question was about AI. I wanted to shortly ask you about AI and the climate transition. Basically, what is good and bad about AI and climate?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, the big tech companies will say AI is going to give us the solutions to climate change. It's going to somehow model weather systems more effectively, or general intelligence will make a breakthrough around some process or some molecule that will enable solid state batteries at scale, whatever, right? Maybe it won't. I think that we need to set aside. From a North American context, I think what's interesting about what AI is that for the first time in almost 50 years, we see energy demand going up. And the question is going to be, how is that energy demand going to be satisfied? And if you want to satisfy that energy demand with natural gas, that's fine. You can't get a turbine for 5 years. At best, you can get a turbine in 5 years from now, right? If you want to satisfy that with renewables, you can start deploying solar and wind tomorrow, right? And so an increase for energy demand means it's going to be satisfied by the most available and low-cost source of energy, which turns out is renewables. Like, I think the fascinating American energy market to pay attention to is Texas. Because this is not Greta's like home country. This is not where climate change is received as like as a dominant popular issue. And yet Texas is adding more renewables than any other jurisdiction in the United States. More solar, more wind. Texas has more battery energy storage systems. During peak demand, batteries tend to satisfy third energy source, second to natural gas and solar in Texas. It's extraordinary. Right. And so I think what AI is going to do is essentially create some, it's a bubble, and we could talk about why it is a bubble, but it's a bubble, but it'll be a productive bubble because it's going to build all of this energy infrastructure. And whether that infrastructure gets used for AI or not, who knows? right? The AI companies will tell you we need it all, and actually I need, Sam Altman will tell you I need 10 times more than what I currently have. That's his story, and I understand why he's making. But the other environmental issue that you have to talk about with AI is water, right? Which is, again, totally reasonable. Water is scarce. Probably the environmental system that gets most impacted by climate change is water availability. That tends to impact the poor and emerging economies the most severely, right? That's all very reasonable. But I think what the AI conversation should be doing is having us pay attention to water consumption of all kinds, right? Because, for example, we use way more water in agriculture than we do in data center operation. And could we be doing a much more effective job at using smart technology to apply water only when and where it's needed? Should we be pricing water more effectively so that you're actually capturing its economic value? Could we be finding ways to reduce water consumption in agriculture without reducing food productivity? There's lots of interesting solutions. So I think it's forcing us to pay attention to this particular issue. And AI has become like the boogeyman. This must be the bad guy, right? Just because it's the new kid on the block. But I think there's all sorts of, I think water waste just in home residences is a bigger user of water than AI.
That's a very good. I hadn't thought about this before, because as you said, the news are all covered with AI. Of course, one the question is about, is there a bubble or not? But the other question is exactly as you said, the need for data centers. And if you listen to Sam Altman and OpenAI and their need or estimate of how much should be invested in data centers, and what will be the electricity consumption, then you also read that there will be an increase in electricity prices and so on. But you think that this will be settled by built infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and okay, but that's a very interesting part that you mentioned about the water consumption. You said that the theme of today is climate change, but since most of the news now are about the AI topic, you said that it's a bubble, and we can talk about why it's a bubble. So maybe you can shortly touch upon it. Why do you think it is a bubble?
A bubble has a few interesting dimensions. The bubble is an irrational exuberance, excitement about what this possibly could be. A bubble has this really interesting tendency to coordinate innovation and coordinate capital allocation and make things that would otherwise be unfundable fundable, because there's just so much cash sloshing through the system. Bubbles tend to be productive, right? We could look at the internet.com bubble of the late 90s in the United States and the stock market crash that followed not long after. It was a very productive bubble, because we built out fiber optic infrastructure across the United States, which then enabled the digital economy a decade later. Now, so yes, some shareholders and some investors lost a lot of money on that bubble, but in the long run, society gained. The build out of rail infrastructure in the late 1800s United States was a bubble. Right? We built out all of this infrastructure, and too much infrastructure, in fact. But in the long run, what that enabled was industrialization and all sorts of productive and useful things. And so AI is, in terms of percent of GDP being invested in CapEx for AI, it's equivalent to the .com. It's actually quite a bit smaller than how much money we spent on rail infrastructure in the 1800s. But those were productive bubbles. My concern with this particular bubble is that GPUs have a very short lifespan. Mm-hmm. Right, and so if
can you explain to our listener what's a GPU?
A GPU is NVIDIA's products, right? So NVIDIA's products, a graphics processing unit, which is a multi-threaded way of solving complex computational problems. Part of why they've been so successful is because they're always improving those technologies. And so by the time you install a GPU cluster, the next version of GPUs available is twice as good as the one that you used to have. And even once you've installed it, it's got a useful lifespan somewhere around 5 years. So the infrastructure that we're trying to build out now, like those GPUs, which are costing tens of billions of dollars, they're going to have a declining asset value over time in a way that like fiber optics or rail does not, right? So now what Sam Altman needs to have happen is that by building out this much GPUs, AGI emerges, artificial general intelligence, and now suddenly I can disrupt labor economics.
And now explain what is AGI
to
listener.
Nobody, I don't think anyone has like a
explain it
precise definition, because you could really argue about what AGI is. There's people who are AI bulls who think we have it already in some respects. Like if I didn't know if I was talking to you or Gemini could be asking me some really great questions with great feedback and great responses. I was like, well, isn't that an artificial general intelligence then? right? But I think that a more technical definition would be that it can solve most problems at like a PhD level capacity without much guidance, with high level prediction and accuracy and all those kinds of useful and wonderful things. Very low likelihood of hallucination, all those things, right? So Altman needs that to come into fruition to justify the capital that he's trying to spend, right? Which I think is possible, but will he be the one who does it, right? Certainly he's convinced the markets that he'll be the one that does it. But on the other hand, he wants to invest, over $1 trillion, and he's currently generating $13 billion of revenue, right? So no investor would look at that and be like, well, here, I'll give you some more money. Right. So if I were concerned, if I were really to buy into the bubble thesis, what I would be looking at is the circular financing. NVIDIA invests in OpenAI, who invests in NVIDIA, who invests in OpenAI, and you have these circular financing deals. You have these circular financing and very debt-heavy deals going on with Cisco. You have these deals being done with AMD and Broadcom, and they're all just kind of investing in each other. And yes, there's a lot of demand for what they're offering, but the revenue, right? That's a little more challenging, right? And so the AI companies that have a path to revenue, I think, are like Claude has a financial plan that suggests we can actually make money doing this. Google can actually make money doing what they're doing because they actually have a lot of the infrastructure already. They have the customer relationships. They have a really interesting way of embedding AI in our day-to-day life in a way that OpenAI does not. Right? OpenAI has to launch a new browser, for example, that's like an AI first browser. And Google's like, I don't need to launch a new browser. I already have everyone installed in my browser. And by the way, I already have AI in everyone's search box right away. And what I thought was notable is that Gemini 3, which just launched a couple of weeks ago, is beating any OpenAI product according to most benchmarks. Right? So it could be that I'm not bullish, particularly on OpenAI. AI in general, sure. I think there's a lot of value to be uncovered, but there's also a lot of work to be done in terms of figuring out how do we integrate this into our workflows, into our lives, into our organizations. It's not easy, right? One of my favorite ideas is this notion of AI slop, right? Where it's like slop is a term in English which means like junk, right? It's like you can eat junk food, but there's no value to it. Right? It's not healthy. It doesn't, it just tastes good temporarily, and then you regret it like 15 minutes later, right? I think that's a lot of AI. It's just,
you mean the content the purpose why you use AI?
It's like slop. So it's like, yes, you could generate an image with AI, but is it any better than an image that a human has made with a camera or with art? It's not, right? It's just slop. And the huge risk in the professional world is work slop. So AI could make you a marketing plan that sounds really fantastic. It could tell you a story that is seemingly fantastic, but it was written by AI, and you're less likely to trust it because it doesn't have human judgment. And so one of the interesting findings that came across recently was how if someone discovers that AI has done, that their coworker is using AI without disclosing it and has written a marketing plan using AI and doesn't tell anyone about it, they're less likely to trust that coworker moving forward because they're like, this plan sounds feasible, but is it actually feasible? Right? Is this based off of your judgment and experience, or is this just a prediction algorithm spitting out what it wants to think is a good marketing plan?
Okay. You have your views on AI, which are currently the most valuable, not the company, but several of the most valuable companies in the world are now linked to AI massively through their investments. My question is, do you invest yourself, and where do you invest?
See, as a professor, you get to have a lot of opinions and be all over the place and then give some very boring answers. I invest in ETFs. And in fact, I invest in a particular Vanguard product, which is aligned with my investment horizon, which self-balances once a quarter between international Canadian equity and a certain ratio of bonds. And probably as I get closer to retirement, I will switch that over. But I basically do nothing. I am a passive investor who tries really hard not to look at the value of my investments.
Sounds like a very good strategy, because what I've read of the researchers of the best returns that people have generated in their portfolios, it's typically the people who have forgotten their access code to their portfolio, that they don't touch it. So they generate the best returns. And as you know, yes, this podcast is on investments, and we try to develop the investment culture in Latvia. I wanted to ask, since you've come from Canada, maybe to ask the opportunity, how do you see the investment culture in Canada? Because, for example, in Sweden, which is, I would say, a quite developed investment market in Europe overall, I would say even in the world, when a child is born, he might get or he gets a stock as a present from his relatives. In Latvia, it's normally a silver spoon or a cross on your neck. What is it in Canada? What's the culture like?
I don't think we have an analogy to that. I mean, because Canada is so multicultural, right? Like the city I'm from, Vancouver, is majority non-white, majority immigrant populations. And depending on which city you are in the greater region of Vancouver, you have some regions which are 70% Chinese. You have some regions which are 60% South Asian, right? So there isn't like a dominant cultural signal like that. I mean, the dream in Canada used to be you would get a home, but now Vancouver, where I come from, is one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world because it's become an investment asset for high net worth individuals. Right. So there isn't that. I hope we can come up with that kind of signal. We have government policies to try and encourage investment, but actually we have one of the most real estate, oddly enough, for a country of our size, we have one of the most real estate dependent economies in the world. Right. Which doesn't make, we have like Singapore prices, but like second largest geography on earth. It's a bit bizarre.
Okay. But thanks, Džastin, for, I think, a very valuable episode on climate change and also your own views on AI. Thanks a lot for participating today.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Yes, and thanks to our listeners, and let's meet in the next episode.
Audio saturā dzirdētā informācija nav uzskatāma par ieguldījumu konsultāciju vai ieteikumu slēgt finanšu tirgus darījumus vai ieguldīt finanšu instrumentos.
Paldies, ka klausījāties! Lai izdevusies diena un uz tikšanos nākamajā sarunā!